It's a pleasure, really, to give you the annual report of your Life Sciences Consortium. As you heard, I co-chair this with Mesa Rothenberg, who leads Pfizer's oncology efforts. And it's great to have Martina George here from Pfizer as the Pfizer representative, because Martine was one of the original Life Sciences Consortium members. So welcome back to the fold, Martine. This is the disclaimer that you normally see at the beginning of these talks, but a different way of saying this is that we leave our company hats off when we go through the door, and that our progress is participatory. We all own the problems, we all own the solutions. It's a consortium. And we leave our company hats at the door to accomplish the LSC mandate, which is to accomplish together what no single company might be able to do on its own. And more importantly, as you've heard from the President and others at this meeting, to be bold and venturesome. So we hope that our accomplishments in terms of contract standardization and moving that work into the preclinical arena, our plans for mining of company databases by third parties to look at alternatives for drug approval, sharing information on negative clinical trials, trials that fail to have a positive endpoint in the spirit of transparency, and probably most important, our early efforts at biomarker co-development with the NCI. Well, what makes the Life Sciences Consortium unique? The first is probably its focus on oncology. You are, of course, the CEO roundtable on cancer. In addition, although we're predominantly companies, you'll see here that we have US Oncology, Hogan Lovells, and Moffitt, which brings special talents to the table. So while we tackle industry problems, we get input from others who are experts who can also contribute to this. And the third and most important asset that we have is access to our CEOs, because this gives us a catalyzing and convening power to bring the right people to the table. The contract standardization required the business offices and the contracting offices, and with the support of our CEOs, we were able to do that. And the final thing that makes us unique is the ability to engage in safe harbors, most successfully with the NCI. Outside this door, there's an editorial that talks about step change in safe harbors. It really gives the vision of the Life Sciences Consortium. And if you want to dive deeper into this, I invite you to do so, because this idea may be relevant to businesses outside of the pharmaceutical sector. Our priorities are really foremost to provide safe and effective medicines to patients more quickly. And the first thing we tackled was to decrease the time for patients to enter cancer clinical trials. The NCI had done some systems analysis that showed that clinical trials often took not months, but years to design and deliver. Does this time make a difference? Yes, and for several reasons. The first is commercial. Even a modestly successful cancer drug will lose $1 million in sales every day that drug fails to make it to market. But as we heard elsewhere in this meeting, the patient is at the center of these, and for every day we delay in getting a new and effective drug to market, there are 3,800 new cancer diagnoses and 1,500 cancer deaths. And equally important in terms of clinical trial execution, each day of delay makes it more likely that a clinical study will fail. If an idea is old, people are not enthusiastic about enrolling patients. So having timely designed and delivered clinical trials is absolutely essential. Another fact of the NCI analysis was that contract negotiation was a key, if not the key bottleneck to starting clinical trials, and that a new drug could spend over a year in contract negotiations while it came to the market. And this was an area which we really thought that we could help to deliver. We took the 11 LSC companies and got redacted contracts from each of them. We had the support of John Niederhuber, the NCI director, with 14 cancer centers also contributing redacted contracts. And these were the big cancer centers, the ones that you would recognize from brand name recognitions, and 5 of the cooperative groups, which did the NCI large-scale phase 3 studies. Hogan Lovells reviewed the redacted contracts, 49 of them, and the agreement templates, 29 of them. This was largely done pro bono, and at one point they had 17 lawyers poring over the contract language in these redacted documents. Even more importantly, they were able to obtain a business letter from the Department of Justice which says that this collaboration of sharing redacted contracts between 11 companies and the government was in fact not anti-competitive. In fact, the Justice Department congratulated us on wanting to bring new and effective medicines to cancer patients more quickly, which isn't bad for government work. And the finding was somewhat surprising in that 2/3 of the language in the actual approved contracts was the same. And it was this commonality which was used to begin the start clauses. And I'll update you on some of the impact of the start clauses. At our meeting in November, which was hosted by Roger Herbin at the Institute of Medicine, we decided that the next step would use the same process of getting redacted agreements, but instead of being in the clinical trial arena, to take this into the laboratory preclinical arena, where the intellectual property risk is greater, but the potential rewards are much greater as well. And we now have the NCI, Hogan and Lovell, and the Moffitt Cancer Center, who's a new member who you saw on the membership slide, who has special expertise in this area, sorting out how we can take the start clauses in clinical trial agreements into the preclinical laboratory arena. It was 2 years ago where we presented these start clauses in this building at the CEO Roundtable. And David Epstein of Novartis said, "We haven't just demonstrated progress or an ability to lead. We've been offered a real gift, a gift to cancer patients worldwide." And since that report 2 years ago, the start clauses have been adopted across the Life Sciences Consortium. In fact, Pfizer has adopted the start agreement clauses across all of its therapeutic areas, inside and outside of oncology. We just authored an abstract for the American Society of Clinical Oncology for presentation at the meeting in Chicago, and a manuscript that's been submitted which will get the word out on what you can achieve by starting where you're going to end. And indeed, at our meeting at the Institute in November, we saw palpable evidence that these clauses were having an impact on study delivery. The second and extremely important priority of the Life Sciences Consortium is to develop a pool of pre-competitive intellectual property for biomarkers. This is extremely important in oncology. What is a biomarker? It's really, simply put, something that shows you that your drug is hitting the target or having an impact. So if you're developing a cholesterol drug, you can look at good cholesterol and bad cholesterol and know whether you have a drug. If you're developing treatments for HIV/AIDS, you can look at viral burden and know if you have a drug. We don't have validated biomarkers in oncology, and it would be equivalent to developing a statin for cholesterol and having as your endpoint the number of strokes, the number of heart attacks, and the number of deaths. That's where we stand in terms of cancer drug approval, and that's not where we want to be. So biomarkers are an extremely important aspect of oncology drug development. It's also an extremely problematic area for us as an industry. The fact is that all of our companies are pursuing similar targets and similar pathways. And so there's reduplication of effort and reduplication of research. We're probably spending 5 or 10 times more than we need to by having individual programs as opposed to being able to collaborate in some safe harbor. In addition, even though these companies do have extreme sophisticated expertise in areas like chemistry and areas like biology, the biomarker programs are really a cottage industry. And what this leads to is two things. One, overspending on research because of a lack of efficiency and collaboration. And more important, delaying and perhaps even altogether missing opportunities for promising therapies, knowing what dose, what schedule to give, because the biomarkers that any individual company is using is not sufficiently robust to pick up an activity signal. So a long-standing aim of the Life Sciences Consortium has been to develop a toolkit of promising biomarkers as a pre-competitive intellectual property that could be used broadly across the industry for drug development. And we've been getting traction on this issue, both at our meeting in November and in follow-on meetings between our and other companies from the NCI. And I'll pause to have Jim Dorschel give his perspective on the importance of biomarkers in collaboration with industry in cancer drug development.
So let me just echo what Greg has said. I think for the past year, you heard about this a year ago at this meeting, I think we've made really good progress, not only in talking to a number of individual companies, but I think for the first time talking to groups of companies that are working together on a particular area that really coincide with the biomarker development activity at the NCI. I think this is very useful in that it basically helps us bring together the resources that the industry has in terms of providing new molecules with the investment that the NCI has made in developing new assays to try to push ahead particular classes of drugs, drugs that we think are very likely in the future to have a big impact. And to that end, the focus of this activity has really been in working together as a consortium very early in the pipeline. Perhaps a year, 2 years, even 3 years before INDs are filed, so that we have the tools necessary before we get into the clinic to really assess whether or not we're hitting the target. I think there's been significant progress. I think Greg agrees, and we hope to actually expand that progress going forward.
I think the important thing about this is that this resource, this biomarker, will become publicly available for all companies to be able to use or not. But I can tell you that at AstraZeneca, we are in fact using the NCI PARP assay because we found it more robust than our own internal program. So there's real advantage for companies to be able to work with the NCI. Another priority of our group is to diminish the regulatory burden of clinical development. And sometimes you learn as much from your mistakes as you do from your successes. But being able to publish data sets or protocols or studies of a failed negative clinical trial, even though it was well done, is more difficult than you might think because journals consider impact factors. And yet, there are very important lessons which can be learned from trials that were well executed but failed to deliver on the expected clinical endpoints. And I'd like to ask Dr. Charles Hughes Jones to give us some aspect of this and plans that Sanofi Aventis has in this area.
Thank you, Greg. I'm here representing a team from Sanofi Aventis who, over the past weeks, have been looking at some of these issues that have been discussed. And the single biggest one is the feasibility of this, I think, well-discussed issue, and that is the huge untapped potential for research amongst all research groups around the globe of clinical trial data sets. And here we're not talking just about the publications that come out in JCO, that come out in The Lancet, The Oncologist, and so on, but the actual data that is collected from every single patient who enters a clinical trial is collected on those case report forms: efficacy, safety, biomarker data, cost, and so on. And I think if that sort of data could be available, there is a huge number of uses that we can imagine, both in terms of research, in terms of epidemiology, and I think there's also a huge number of uses for that data that we can only guess at and see what happens when we put that data out there. So the goal for this team was to look at the feasibility, which is not a new one, and there are, again, existing pockets where there's been some activity in this area, of producing a industry-led public sharing of actual oncology trial data sets on an online database that could be investigated. And I think that would be immensely useful for three reasons. One, I think there's no doubt that it would facilitate the advancement of clinical science, and I think there's no doubt about that whatsoever. I think the second is it would help us as industry groups together to assess the usability of that data, how we're all collecting data in different ways, and is there any way that we can speed things up and learn from each other. And I think thirdly, to honour all the patients who've contributed a huge amount to this data, and rather than it being hidden in company vaults, to make it available to the research community. So the question immediately is just how do we get that done? We looked at that. There's obviously huge legal, statistical, programming issues, but I think what we found as a group is none of them seem to be insurmountable. And I think if we break it down into small chunks, it's something that can be achieved. I think the single biggest thing that came up, Greg, was this chicken and egg situation, that no debate, no database, no data, no data, no database. And so in terms of being bold and venturesome, this was something that was suggested by Debashish and I put forward to the group, that we would offer from Sanofi to donate, as it were, or to put forward the comparator arms to two large major data sets from two international phase 3 clinical studies that we've done in the last few years in metastatic prostate cancer, and use that as a testing ground, and for us as a life sciences consortium to start seeing, by putting that data out there, how does it start to get used and to start to investigate some of those problems.
Is it a big file?
It's a large file. That's one of the challenges. These files typically can be upwards of multiple gigabytes of data, and that's one of the challenges we're going to have to solve.
We may need help from SAS in that regard.
Greg, could I make a comment?
I was going to ask you, Marty, to make a comment specifically about publishing well-done but negative clinical studies and why that's important.
Thanks very much, Greg. Because so that all are aware of it, and Charles just gave a very good summary as to the three most important reasons why these data need not just to be warehoused where they could be accessible, but they need to be published in a cogent fashion that can then be cited in the global literature permanently, and that not only the summation be important as to what the outcomes were of that given trial, but that the data itself could be mined and studied. And those large data sets, until really the access of high-speed internet accessibility, was all but impossible to really achieve. With companies being led in many instances by SAS, that now is available. And one journal, just one, and there will be others I know, but the first journal that has committed to doing so is The Oncologist, in which papers such as the one that Charles and his colleagues, Debashish Chowdhury and others at Sanofi Aventis, have now pledged to submit for peer-reviewed publication consideration, along with these enormous data sets, when accepted by peer review, will be published in the journal, and those enormous data sets will be made permanently available online. And that's the difference. And that has never happened before. May I just come back to what I've said probably now repeatedly? The convening power of the Roundtable, and in this case, of the Roundtable's Life Sciences Consortium, has in fact, and here is the first example, a pioneering example that we should salute Charles and his colleagues and Sanofi Aventis in general, the first example of a company stepping up now and doing something truly bold and venturesome, and we encourage others in the room to please do the same. Thank you, Greg. Back to you.
Hey, Greg, before we go on, maybe, Jim, did you want to make a comment?
Oh, yeah, SAS will be glad to host it. It'll also provide an analytical platform that you can just analyze it right there. So you won't even have to move it.
That would be great. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Did you all get the ease with which Jim said that? That's simple.
It's a nice being a private company. Board decisions are made very rapidly.
Thank you, Charles, Marty, and Jim. Slide on, please. There were also some emerging issues which came from our meeting in November, which I thought was a very successful meeting. We had good attendance in person at the Institute of Medicine in Washington, D.C., and Roger, thank you for hosting that meeting. One of the most important presentations was given by Laura Esserman, who talked about probably the most important breast cancer study which is going on in the NCI right now. And this uses personalized health care to predict which patients will respond to given agents, but will rapidly cycle drugs out of trials to only choose the most promising agents. This is called I-SPY. or the investigation of serial studies to predict therapeutic response. A very high priority study, but a study that can only be done with the treasure which lies in the pipelines of the companies at that meeting. And we pledged not only to provide compounds of interest to I-SPY, but also to consider helping to fund some of these studies, because it was sobering to realize that the largest donor to the I-SPY trials was not a drug company. It was a grocer, and it's Safeway Foundation, who's actually provided the bulk of the money to support this really innovative, iterative method of developing drugs in breast cancer. And suffice it to say, this model could be used in lung cancer, prostate cancer, and other solid tumors of adulthood. The next bullet there is ARCAD, and this is a new foundation, and it bespeaks to the fact that data sets, as we've just heard, can be immensely powerful tools for drug approval. For example, Rich Goldberg was able to use data sets with his colleagues from government-sponsored studies, cooperative group studies, not only in the US, but in Europe, to look at tens of thousands of patients and make correlations. And what they found was that disease-free survival at 3 years comported with overall survival at 5 years. And the FDA was actually willing to take disease-free survival at 3 years as a surrogate endpoint for overall survival. Very important things empowered by good data sets and brilliant statisticians, by the way, but it shows you how this kind of information, which is on the shelf, can be used to speed drug approval, potentially getting a drug to patients 2 years sooner. And we've been talking with Richard and ARCAD about actually using industry data sets, because I would venture to say that the richness of industry data sets, which we collect much more than cooperative groups, would even be more valuable for this kind of data mining. And Richard, I was just wondering if you could give us your perspective and your vision on how industry data sets could be used to improve drug access.
So a couple of things. The program that we use to validate the 3-year disease-free survival correlating with overall survival was in colorectal cancer. It came from data sets that were mainly generated by academic endeavors, NCI-funded programs here, and programs throughout Europe. And the FDA accepted this as a new endpoint in colorectal cancer, and it actually led to approval of oxaliplatin early in the United States to the benefit of patients with colorectal cancer. So the same group essentially that's done this is interested in collecting data in advanced colorectal cancer. And we already have data sets from about 20,000 patients, and many of those patients are entered on clinical trials funded by companies in the room. There are a number of additional trials that we would like to get. Unfortunately, many of those trials are owned by companies that are not in this room. But we believe that a spirit of cooperation among the people on the CEO roundtable on cancer could be an incentive to the other companies to want to collaborate with us. Many of the advanced disease studies were run by companies not run by the cooperative groups, and so in order to really realize the power of this data, we need your help. If we can do that, then we believe that we can help to design new endpoints, perhaps besides progression-free survival, which, as you all know, does not always correlate with overall survival, even though we see benefits because of treatments in 3rd and 4th and 5th line that are now available. It also, we believe, will help us to validate biomarkers in addition. Now we've had conversations with Rick Pazder at the FDA. They're clearly interested in improving both biomarker use and clinical endpoints. And we believe that this would benefit the academic community, our colleagues in industry, and most especially the patients.
Yeah, it's really potentially quite big. And if you need help contacting any of those non-member companies, let us know, because I think we know where they live, and the value of the work as well. And finally, we'll be continuing to engage the industry representative on the Oncology Drugs Advisory Committee, which advises the FDA on which cancer drugs to approve. having this consortium has been very useful to ferret out what are common priorities across the companies. And we've been able, for example, to discuss with the FDAs some of the important differences between the approval of drugs in children, cancer drugs in children, between the EU and the US. And we're also going to be celebrating our successes and accomplishments. The Life Sciences Consortium is establishing an award that will recognize a company with medical clinical research and development that includes adoption of the START clauses, not only in cancer, but other therapeutic areas, innovative ways of processing data, and cross-company collaboration, which is increasingly a theme. And interestingly, the Association of American Cancer Institutes has agreed to establish a parallel award that will recognize academic centers for similar accomplishments. And the inaugural awards will be made late in 2011 or early in 2012, perhaps at the next CEO Roundtable meeting. And then finally, what really makes the Life Sciences Consortium is not the LSC, but the CEO, because it's the support of our leadership that gives us the galvanizing, convening power to bring the right people to the table to solve problems. And the presence of our leadership here at this meeting speaks volumes and gives real meaning to the work that your LSC is trying to achieve. So thank you all.
Greg, thank you and all of those who have participated, not only in the Life Sciences Consortium, but those such as Rich and Charles who have made commentary. One thing that, because of his innate humility, he did not himself mention, that is that Greg is the industry representative to ODAC, that advisory body that advises the FDA on every drug that is coming before it, obviously the FDA then makes the final decision on whether a drug is to be registered or not. That's a fact. This is an editorial. He's the finest industry representative that ODAC has ever had. Understanding that he does not represent AstraZeneca, his company, but that he represents the research-intensive pharmaceutical industry, and you deserve our applause and our gratitude for that as well. Thank you, Greg.